this isn't a novel. Um, you're not trying to save the final twist to the end. You need to show your best imagery right up at the front. And I actually don't know that that's always applicable.
Bringing that into the digital realm where we can share that content really quickly, and you still have the ability to kind of do like we're comfortable with. That layer of trace is still in there, and you can go back to it, which is nice.
Yeah, I kind of a thought thinking about that is technology. I feel like helps bring up the lay people, like people who aren't trained designers and architects. They're all of a sudden they start having the capability of doing things. And maybe this is sacrilege coming from the digital practice side. At the end of the day, if those red lines become what we deliver to the contractor or the client, I don't know if I have that much heartburn about it.
Hello and welcome to the Unverified podcast. I'm Laszlo Andrasi. Today I'm joined by architects Wyatt and David Kofford as we talk about how the medium affects the message. Unfortunately, we weren't able to record video for our session, but we did find a Tom Main video with his lecture to Cyrus that actually correlates really well to our conversation, so I'll kind of sprinkle those in. Hope you enjoy the conversation and some clips. Thanks.
Protecting your voice and about projecting your own kind of ideals, and in a field that's very difficult in that manner. You're defined by other people, and the work is somewhat contaminated, or it's connected to various realities.
So we were talking about storytelling and design, and the conversation was really interesting because we Paul and I probably approach design and storytelling very similarly, coming through architecture school, kind of building the narrative and trying to understand the client and the user groups, versus Paul or Scott comes at it from a visualization standpoint, from a game design standpoint, where you have kind of a narrative and you're constructing the medium on how best to deliver that message. And I think it probably all comes down, like we all do a little bit of both of those things every once in a while, but it was interesting hearing how both of them approached it in very unique ways. So yeah, that's what prompted this conversation. And I think maybe before we get started, do you guys mind if we have, if you give a little introduction on yourselves?
Sure. What do you want to know?
Yeah. Name, where you work, that kind of stuff.
Sure. Well, I'm talking, so I can just go first. I'm David Kofford. I'm an architect at Perkins & Will. I studied at the University of Manchester before working for a company in Utah for a long time, for nearly a decade, and then I moved to Chicago, Perkins & Will office. So I'm a project architect here, mainly working in K-12 right now, but I've got experience with religious structures, some commercial, little bit of sports and rec. But yeah, K-12 now.
Speaking of sports and rec, Wyatt Beard. I've been with Perkins & Will for about 7-ish years, and came over in an acquisition of a firm that I was working for here in Chicago as well, and working primarily in sports and rec. And then through the firm, which has been a really wonderful thing, have got an opportunity to look at and work on essentially any type of building work that the firm does, which is just a really great opportunity to have fun and try different things, and where you work in one practice area, learning something there, and then how does that idea and methodology maybe start to transform and inform other works from these different things that we get to do. So I'd like to think of myself a little bit of a jack of all trades, but having a history in working in sports.
It got me thinking about how, David, Wyatt, even a little bit on myself, where especially when you go into Perkins and Will, all of a sudden you're exposed to a whole bunch of typologies that you never thought you would be in. At my previous firm, it was very similar. I worked on pretty much just hospitality and healthcare, which strangely are more related than they seem. But it's been fun being able to kind of touch a whole bunch of different projects, and it's definitely helped me keep a more open mind. But yeah, I guess I would love to hear you guys' thoughts, especially kind of my monologue in the beginning about storytelling in design. How do you guys approach that?
This is a great question. I think it evolves uniquely in every project as we kind of learn the parameters of what we're trying to accomplish. I think it's always about how might we share the ideas that we have, and that takes a lot of different forms. Dave and I are sitting in a conference room right now with a mock-up of looks like an RFP response, and we do that in a lot of different ways. There's text format. Some people are very word driven in what they look for or need to hear from an auditory standpoint. So I think we try to make sure that communication is clear in what we want to get across in the words that we choose, and then in the image making, that it's speaking to what's important to us and what we understand is important to the client. And that comes through generally a lot of dialogue back and forth as we try to narrow that and kind of get to the crux of what we're trying to get across.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking about how I remember my final year of my master's degree, I had a professor who was really good at visual communication, and I learned a lot about even just renderings and how to make them a bit more communicative. But one thing they said about portfolios was this isn't a novel. You're not trying to save the final twist to the end. You need to show your best imagery right up at the front. And I actually don't know that that's always applicable. I think you have to pick and choose. Sometimes you need to walk a client to your conclusion, talk them through the process, and then hit them with the final image so that they're bought in along the way. Whereas sometimes you need to, if it's more RFP, if it's more trying to win a project, you need to show them like the big image up at front. Like, I think you have to really tailor that communication to the situation. It's kind of a tightrope. I think you have to ask yourself the question every time.
Yeah.
Another level, you're producing things, and it takes you someplace that you're not even intending to do in the beginning. We're building a fragment of this residence, and we're building a kind of an area that has a certain kind of intensification where we've invested in design, et cetera. We build the fragment, and then all of a sudden out of that, we look at this thing, and it takes us someplace, and we start discussing a notion that the fragment is, in fact, much more interesting than the project we're thinking about. And it's taking us in a very, very different direction, which is leading us to, it's challenging our conceptual notion of architecture. And in this case, it's challenging very basic notions of organization and classic organization, certainly Palladian classical organization, a part whole.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it almost gets me into thinking about there has to be an understanding of what the message should be from the very beginning, before you could decide on how we're going to represent that message or communicate it to whoever the particular audience is. And so it's almost the title for this episode was going to be how the message or how the medium affects the message. I'm almost wondering if it's going to be flipped. Like, how does the message affect the medium in a way? What's the point that we're even trying to get at?
Yeah.
And that helps us decide. Is it a sketch? Is it an landscape rendering? Is it just a text-based kind of thing? It probably really depends.
Yeah, I think it definitely does. And trial and error, to be totally honest, also comes into play here, where depending on how things go when you try one medium, if it's successful, I feel like we oftentimes then want to say, okay, well, stay the course as long as possible and then jump to the next thing. And then if it isn't working, sometimes that's where we need to then shift gears and try another way. And some folks are happy to come along with that, loose sketch and ideate and imagine along right there with you, and others really need to see it where it's like, oh, can I look and feel and touch where I understand that that chair is made of leather and it's not fabric. And so I think it just depends on who you're working with, and that can be a big part of it.
And some of it as well is trying to make sure that you keep the focus where it needs to be. So like to your point about the medium or the message is the medium. I can't remember which way around you said it, Laszlo, but you're trying to make sure you don't focus on the wrong things or to get the attention on something that you don't intend. So like that's why we might start with something more sketchy to say, no, we're just looking at form, and it might be paired with some precedent images, because you're trying to say, look, we haven't settled down. Don't get too hung up on what you're seeing. We just want to get a flavor. But you're right. It really does depend, and yeah, you do take it as far as you can, keeping it as light as possible. Yeah.
Yeah. The question I had, David, was speaking of how people can interpret our visualizations differently. Have you guys seen something in your career or a previous example on how you presented something and it was taken completely differently and it kind of changed the whole direction of the project?
The only thing that comes to mind, because I'd never really thought about this question before, but the thing that came to mind was how it's happened a few times in my career where you've perhaps taken one idea too far, or you've hardlined it a bit too much. You've rendered it out, and they just don't like it, or they a client can just think that you are not on the same page when you really just wanted to. You're only ideating, and with things like SketchUp, we can get into 3D really easily, really quickly, and sometimes that spooks a client. So I've seen that, and then we've had to go back, even if the idea was pretty good. Just you get clients who just, that's on us as designers. We need to read the room, we need to understand. But I've certainly done that a couple times where I've perhaps stepped a bit too far and had to pull back or completely change direction.
Yeah, I even think about that question in terms of our teaming and how we work together with one another. And anyone who looks at the work sees things through their own eyes. And like, as we describe things, like oftentimes can think of situations where the sketch turned, while you're watching someone else work, you see one thing and then it turns and it's like, oh, I see it totally differently now. And then through that back and forth process of communicating to one another through, in this case, like maybe a sketch medium, that thing may become more galvanized because you're discussing the principles that you're trying to put into the drawing and work through it. So as it even changes, like sometimes that idea of sharing client might be your peer or your partner on a project as you work together through things. So I think it's just so interesting, like how we talk about things and move the project forward. And it's just a very dynamic element, and trying to make sure that it's becoming a better entity along the way.
Yeah, that's a great point, Wyatt. And it's interesting how I feel like the design intent could be really kind of muddied or lost when we hardline images too quickly, especially if we're trying to just show iterations to our colleagues, or I mean, even a client at an early stage, where if we just sketched on top of something really quickly and try to communicate what the intention of this image or the design kind of move was, It's much more intuitive and kind of easier to communicate to, and probably lets us communicate the design better just verbally because we put our hand to paper and pre-analyze that image.
Yeah, Laszlo, we're not sharing any video today, but for our chat, I brought some books because
Yeah.
I like reading and
Put them in the show notes.
oh, there you go. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I'll put the images like in the video so that people have something to, I'll
With
put
that,
some.
the reason it's like you're here even though you're not, which is I brought a book from Flores and Pratt's Drawing Without Erasing and Other Essays. Just that notion of working over something and continuing, grab another sheet and draw on top of it, and like how that thing morphs and evolves is so interesting when you think about that chosen medium that you're using to work through content. And like, how is that process different and informative in a way that, drawing in SketchUp, for example, might create a different outcome where you're committing to something and then continuing to go through it versus this thing where you might have multiple layers that you can, slide in and out. So it's just so interesting to think about that process.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking that, I had an architecture professor who, first year of architecture school when I was, 20 years ago nearly, we weren't allowed to go digital the first year. We had to stay analog, hand drawn. And I had my drawing board and square and stuff. And this one professor encouraged us not to erase anything, just like you're saying.
Yeah.
and to show your working lines, not just your final lines. You'd then make sure there was a quality to the final lines, the line weights and things, but or maybe a watercolor wash as well to like enhance it. But I think about that even now that I'm actually just working on a project where we're trying to figure out a facade, a system, like as far as like design wise, kind of get it more regular. And so we're doing it in Revit because you can draw to scale really quickly. And I've just got essentially a drafting view of a facade, but I'm doing a lot of line work in red that I probably won't delete. It won't go to a client, but it's essential to communicate to team members and to design leadership that like, this is where this has come from. And so effectively even though it's in this modern format and it's not trace lines and layers of trace paper and pencil, but it's something that is still communicating those previous
You're bringing
moves.
forward this kind of process that you learned and
right,
essentially been doing it since the very beginning, right? And then like there's a good reason for that, and I think that's so smart to bring that practice into your work in the digital as well. Like that.
Yeah, for me it's kind of essential. You've got to figure things out in line work. As much as this is a 3D medium entirely, we've been drawing in 2D for at least 1,000 years, if not 4,000 years. And so that's the only way I know how to figure things out is initially in 2D, and then go from there.
And what's happening, and this is kind of enormous now, and it's, I think, still in works, drawing and model are becoming more similar.
And maybe this is sacrilege coming from the digital practice side. At the end of the day, if those red lines become what we deliver to the contractor or the client, I don't know if I have that much heartburn about it. Like, as long as it's communicating the design intent effectively and is coordinated, of course, I think that's okay. Because I mean, what we end up doing with 3D models anyway is flattening them out into 2D drawings. So it's not like we're really leveraging the BIM of it all.
And I think you hit on a point that like communication generally, and I'm not a linguist, but communication is about it's about saying the minimum you need to get the point across, like saving as much energy. and as much breadth, just say the things we need to say. And I think that's true of visual communication, or the communication we have to do here at work that's not always visual. Sometimes it's presentations, it's all of the above. And so it's like, what is the economy here? Will a hand sketch suffice? Do we need to do 20 renderings at all different angles to really sell this? And the answer to both of those could be yes. But it's about what is the most economical way. I think in the end, we're not always economical in our process, which I don't think it should be, but we have to be economical in our communication, just to get it done.
I can think of some really iconic renderings that are done of the last, call it like decade or something, where there is the one image that's like, oh, that's going to be a really compelling project because of that reductive character. Like, you don't need the other 19. It's like that one is the one that's just like, this is unlike anything else that's being put out there. But it was that process of being creative and understanding the scope of the project and the storytelling in such a way that, like, I can think of maybe those classics where it's like the architect Black Cape comes into the room, unrolls the drawing, and like there's the master vision. But it's like, we still kind of do the same thing. It's just in like maybe a different form. But I think it's so interesting, your idea of trying to be effective in our communication, and oftentimes that's being powerful through the reductive quality of getting to the essence of it in a very formative way.
You got to know what the essence is, or at least discover it and then refine it. A lot of the times we're just snapping views because we can, but we have to show this side, we have to show that side, without thought going into what are we trying to communicate here. So I think that's really important, to have an intention.
And there's another thing that took place here that was huge, is that the drawing and the model come together, and with that you can crawl in this thing you made, and you can understand it perceptually versus conceptually. Right?
Well, it's so funny you mentioned curtain walls, David, because anytime you look at an AI image of architecture, the number one thing, the extra finger in architecture for AI is curtain walls, because they'll never make sense from an AI image. Like the grid doesn't make sense, and you could totally pick it out. And it's interesting how I think a lot of people end up being okay with those images and not realizing how the medium they chose to use, for example AI, affects the real design intent of that image, or of the architecture potentially, right? It makes decisions for you, and kind of any tool we use has that kind of quality, where you have to be okay with what is the default kind of application of the tools that you use as you use them, and being very aware of that, I think, is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are certain qualities that you can in a finished building where you can almost see if something was designed and documented in one medium or another, or I've certainly been guilty. I've seen finished buildings where I'm like, yep, I can see that I did that in SketchUp. Like, to me, it's almost like, I don't think anybody else would be so critical, but for me, I'd be like, yeah, there's a level of detail there that I'm like, it needed a hand, or it needed something else. I think the same can be said of Revit as well. That I don't think that's controversial to say that, like, there's a certain orthogonal quality that I happen to like, but just shines out of a finished building that was documented in Revit. And perhaps that's just the way it is. But I think there's almost a fingerprint on a finished building of the medium it was documented or ideated in.
Yeah, I think short of, well, I was going to say hand sketching on paper, but I would also then kind of put into that conversation about if you were to model something out of clay or in a model shop where you were constructing and exploring how that three-dimensional character were to come together through a different medium in that way, that your ability to see it evolve is maybe more open-ended than, say, through that software that has a tendency to lead you to all 90-degree angles or something, because like
Right.
it snaps and that's what it kind of wants to do, versus say like a Tom Morphosis where it was like, oh, I'm going to be intentionally 3 degrees off through the whole project. But like that's a design choice and philosophy of like pushing that in the construction of it. It's kind of interesting.
It gives you a lot to think about how much we, autonomy we think we have with design. And I think we do have quite a bit. But yeah, just being aware of how these different techniques affect the overall kind of design and even the design intent at the end of the day is just very interesting. Do you guys think it's important then to explore many different mediums when you're designing? Is that helpful in the overall, like the end product that we produce?
That's what we were taught in architecture school, and I don't think many of us make rough models anymore. But I have found it very useful. I mean, I do still sketch a lot when I'm trying to figure out an idea, but I'm going off of maybe it's it's an elevation that we've created in Revit, and then I print it out and I trace over it and I put it back, or a 3D view that I am my natural process is to do that by default, except the 3D. I don't really build 3D models, rough, rip apart models. But I think we still do it, and I still see it a little bit around our industry where you're perhaps designing a specific space, or you're wanting to try and figure out the light or something really specific. I see a lot of that still, but yeah, we all wish we could do a little more.
Yeah, I agree, and it'd be interesting. I think people put down the pencil really quickly, which is kind of a shame. Just walking around the office or anything, it'd be cool to see a lot more kind of trace paper around, I think, or pin-up sessions. So, hopefully we can kind of inspire people to do that. I mean, I think the medium kind of changes over time in a project where we start, very loose, and then it obviously, as the nature of the project kind of goes on, it becomes more complex. We have to start increasing the resolution and hardlining things a lot sooner. I guess my question to you guys is, or a thing I've noticed, when you decide to go to that like higher fidelity rendering, like, all right, now we're going to do a polished landscape, or once you jump into Lumion or Twinmotion land, it's really hard to get back to that sketch mode, because you kind of open Pandora's box to the client, or even our design leadership, and then it's hard to go back into that more loose kind of state where you're more exploratory. How do you think that affects the overall process?
One of the elements to that, Laszlo, that I guess I would think about is we commit, right? We're trying to get more and more towards what we deliver, which at the end of the day is a built structure that is probably being inhabited. And so that development process is like, we aren't typically making drawings beautiful for the sake of them being beautiful, and whatever that medium is, sketch, watercolor, Inkscape rendering, that usually isn't the end goal. And so I think for us, it's usually getting this into like the 98% mark, like where it's communicating, it's allowing us to move to the next step in the process, and that fidelity is appropriate to the level of the communication that's needed for that goal. So, I mean, I'm even already kind of like jumping to like, you cloud a drawing after it's been done and you need to make a change. It's like you want to call attention to that, to the audience that needs to get it. So like what that contractor is getting is like, you can give him that beautiful rendering, but he's like, I don't know. I mean, I could interpret it one way, but tell me exactly what you want as best you can. And that's why we deliver the package of drawings that we do. And so it's like, it's an interesting question that seems to always be changing, like what that goal is.
And it's good. The models now are much more kind of, they're moving this into the material world, into something much more the realistic world, having to do with all of the kind of pragmatics of the building that are again now translating much more literally kind of an idea. And again, I'm making a direct connection between the drawings as an idea and their effect on an organizational idea, which has to do with the looking for a new notion of coherence of organization.
Yeah, I'm ashamed to say I got 10, 12 years into my career before I heard it so succinctly. But Mark Walsh, one of our colleagues here at Perkins and Will, said in a meeting just last year, he said, we're not in the business of architectural drawings, we're in the business of creating buildings. And that just kind of blew my mind so far into my career that, like, exactly to your point, the renderings are not the product. Mm-hmm. The building sections are not the products. The model making is not the product. The hand sketch is not the product. The building is the product. And all of that should serve the communication to those who build it, to those who are paying for it, to those who are going to use it, to get the building built. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. It's kind of an ego hit, right? I mean, especially for people who love visualizations, and architectural drawings, to kind of have to take a step back and realize the end goal is getting this thing built. It doesn't have to be, as long as that's being done effectively, then you've kind of done your job. Yeah, that's super interesting.
I think too, though, Laszlo, this goes back to the other books that I brought from my library here for our discussion. I brought Levius Wood's book, Radical Reconstruction, in part because in the way I would then like immediately just turn everything we just said on its head and say, well, there are designers, architects that their whole world literally is the kind of paper architecture of putting out beautiful, kind of groundbreaking work that may never get built in the form that you see in that two-dimensional medium.
Zaha's paintings.
Yeah, Zaha's paintings, which is like explorations that help inform other parts of what gets delivered. But like by being exploratory, I feel like in those ways opens up other elements and attributes in the built environment. So it's kind of an exciting thing in those kind of push and pull of built and unbuilt
versus other methods of looking at the project. And then I've been continuing this idea of chance behavior and willfulness and chance. And the models now are completely conceptual, and they're looking for pursuing ideas of organizing complex behavior spatially and organizationally, and using extremely explicit rules.
Yeah, I think that's almost in the I always think of it in terms of that haute couture kind of the stuff that's on the runways has been thought about, and like they're pushing boundaries, mm-hmm. and they're testing, and they're doing really outlandish stuff, and then what eventually trickles down to what's sold at the mall, mm-hmm. is different, but it'll have traces of it.
Yeah.
And so I think like any art form, we do need those people who are perhaps less about communicating, maybe more about exploratory art, and mm-hmm. and then it does trickle into the built environment eventually, whether it's they do it or the people do it. I think about whenever I see a kind of a ribbon form around a building. I always think of back to Gyroscopic Horizons, the book by Neil Denari in the 90s. And I think he only has a handful of built projects and they were very late. Oh, nice. But he basically, his kind of whole thing in that book at least was about the floor becoming the wall, becoming the roof. And you see it everywhere now, but he just was exploring these visual images and things that that just took time and for people to adopt. And that wasn't really with maybe not the clients in mind. It was an academic exercise. Yeah, good point.
It gets me thinking about, Perkins and Will is a very service and design aligned firm, right? And what we end up doing, I think all three of us have entered, whether they're external or internal competitions, to help kind of get those academic creative juices flowing, kind of refine our own design palette. I think it's important to be able to go back to that kind of academic mind frame to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a box, because real projects, the design happens throughout the whole thing, but you can fall into that trap, especially later in the project, where you just become very technical and solution kind of oriented. So there's probably huge benefits of making sure that you're going out of your comfort zone and exploring things.
Listening to you bring that up, Laszlo, I was thinking about that competition that I had with some peers here in the studio a few years back. And the brief was you had to turn in A0 sheet, and it had to have wall sections and plans and a narrative piece. And the ask was, tell us everything we need to know about your project to judge it accordingly. And our group was having a discussion about it. I was like, wouldn't it be great to think about it really more like a movie poster, and we just one image through the whole thing, and then we put a QR code on it, and then you could still get technically all of the content that they've asked for is still there. You just had to use this other medium to get to it. So we went for it, and it turned out great. And I think that notion of still being exploratory or academic in your thinking, still has its ways of worming its way into the work as we still try to deliver built buildings. And how we ultimately get there, I think, it's fun to still try new things, see what works, and then where it doesn't, go back to the tried and trues, but kind of makes the each day process enjoyable as we work through these things.
And at the end of the day, we are, as architects, designing a building, but those buildings are occupied by people. So there's like this interesting kind of layers to that, where sometimes the people who hire us to build this building aren't the people occupying it, and or they are, and there's different user groups, and it becomes very, very complex. And I think that's where the exploring different kind of avenues or ways of thinking becomes really, really valuable, because you don't know, like you were saying, it's kind of a trial and error. Oftentimes, when you present many different things and then you find what sticks. It could happen like that for any project. It's just so complex. Even a client that you've worked with a ton of over a long period of time, they could get a new employee or a new person kind of managing this particular project, and you have to adjust on the fly. So I think staying creative and trying to be kind of mobile with that is very important.
We're nodding. Yeah.
Yeah. Laszlo, where do you see us in your kind of esteemed position as the kind of architect, digital practitioner, someone who still dabbles in drawings and watercolors, like kind of running that whole gamut. Where do you see us going? Like, what's new, what's good, what's cool?
I think what's really exciting about that is it's going to be, yeah, the new stuff is always going to be interesting to explore AI and all that. But I see more and more kind of interest in the analog as well, model building. In all of our office and kind of across the industry, I see people getting more 3D printers, laser cutters. We want to use the CNC machine. People are interested in sketching programs and, kind of all that. So it's not going to be a radical shift, at least not immediately, which I think is really exciting. It's another tool, right? Us as architects we've been great like adopters of different mediums or tools or styles like throughout our whole history, and I think this is just another kind of bookmark to that, where we adapt certain technologies and use that to facilitate our design and communication. It'll be really interesting to see how, I think, as we advance further in our careers and people of our generation become the head kind of client, how the narrative of how we communicate changes, right? It might become a lot more kind of dynamic, which is pretty exciting to think about. Yeah, it's kind of tough to say. Yeah, I hope we don't lose the analog. I mean, I that's why I kind of push myself to keep that, trying to strive to be better and better at that. But yeah, who knows? You throw a sketch into Midjourney or whatever, and you get a rendering out of it. That's pretty impressive.
Seeing it in its somewhat idealized form at some point. And then now the ability of moving from macro to micro is now completely institutionalized within the group, and we can operate at a scale of the facade, and we're taking responsibility for making something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I kind of a thought thinking about that is technology. I feel like helps bring up the lay people, like people who aren't trained designers and architects. They're all of a sudden they start having the capability of doing things themselves. So all of a sudden they can come to a meeting and be like, hey, here's a rendering I did, or here's a AI image I produced. Architect, can you do this for me? I think that's kind of that's a danger that I think could happen.
It is.
I don't. Yeah.
But I'll actually give like a really, hopefully a fun example of where this can be a good surprise. I was with my sister over the weekend, and she has a house. It's of a certain vintage and has been doing a lot of work to it, and incredible process to kind of see play out as an architect, kind of on the side while she works through all these things. She's also very creative in her own way. And she came over and then said, oh, hey, do you think I could do something like this with my house? And she had put into a prompt and submitted the photo of the home and then a couple of different iterations. And she worked through the process to kind of refine what her vision was through the medium. And I was totally blown away. I was like, one, great eye. I like the one that you picked. As like how you wanted to proceed. And then she was going to use that as a way in which to have conversations about picking the right materials that were suitable for her vision, get the coloration and texture that she was looking for. And it was just so cool to me of like, now we can speak the same language through this thing that was like totally unexpected. Otherwise, what she could have done was come to me and say, I'd like, to work on the exterior of the home, and can you help me do that? And that process would have been really enjoyable to work through together. But we just expedited the whole thing because she got herself far enough along where like this is where I'd like to go with it. So I would just share that yeah, it's like a positive experience of when other people who don't really have the same background can then start to have a conversation alongside someone who has a greater expertise. It was a good thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, bringing more people to the table, I think, is always a good thing, and hearing a variety of perspectives. It's probably why I always advocate to show anything we kind of produce to a non-architect just to see what their impression is before you show it to the client. And see, I mean, the classic examples, like I had a rendering. I'm not sure if it was on a project we worked on, but it was a project where there was a bottle of alcohol on a table in like the mid-ground of the rendering, and never would have picked that up, but the client sure did. And that and yeah, so it's interesting how our eye gravitates to certain things because of our expertise and our training versus kind of regular people look at almost everything else. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think in general that's a really good thing, and it's interesting how I feel like as designers it could definitely help us too, but it unlocks people ability to kind of explore these topics in ways that they never could before. Yeah, we'll see how that shakes out.
Drawing and model are starting to glue together. So we're giving them a document, a book about the project. It includes now the three-dimensional. And of course now as a presentation tool, it's something very literal. And it's going to be extremely useful for a client that understands it even in this abstract form. And it's a synthesizing tool, right? And it's going to be useful for your argument, for the completion of an idea, for a group of people that are going to be less informed and less interested in your particular conceptual interests, right?
I guess I wonder if we wrap this up, guys. I guess you flipped on me, Wyatt, on where I think we're heading. How about you guys? What do you think is the future for design communication? David, you want to go first?
You know what you're gonna say?
I know I have one element, which is the blending of all of them in some capacity, which is a number of folks around the studio use the iPad and a specific piece of technology in there called Morpholio Trace. Not necessarily a plug for it in like a sponsorship way, but just to say that like it's a thing that has taken root. It was very organic of a couple individuals like I'm doing this thing, and then like maybe you try it, and then it's worked out really well where it's still hand drawing, which is a method that we're all quite comfortable in. And then bringing that into the digital realm where we can share that content really quickly, and you still have the ability to kind of do like we're comfortable with. That layer of trace is still in there, and you can go back to it, which is nice. And I think it helps us not overcook things like we were discussing earlier. And so I think that blending of our understandings of new mediums with old techniques allows for a really fertile ground of creativity. And that's something I look forward to more people engaging in that way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I while you're talking about your sister's journey with a bit of AI and all that, I was thinking about I recently moved into a new place a year ago, and I'll as an architect, I don't know if I should admit this in a public forum, but my interior design eye isn't well honed, we'll put it that way. And so I spent a little bit of time just generating images in AI, and it meant that I could be like, okay, so these are the directions, and these are the elements, and these are the colors, but then I also stepped back and I looked through my architectural like precedent books, or I bought one specifically about like interiors, like a Taschen book about interiors. And then I started looking in magazines, and then I built it in Revit, and I've got the plans and I've got elevations, and I can start to understand the 3D form and the scale. and then I go back to then like, online, like what's actually available at furniture stores, and then I go back, and then I eventually created a mood board in Photoshop of different things based on photographs of my place. So it's like I used basically every medium to arrive at something that I feel as though I now have a design for my place, and so now I can pick and choose furniture items or figure out how I'm going to build some shelves or whatever based on that. And so it's like it's a kind of microcosm of 800 square feet, and that's if I'm being generous, of what I can do based on all of these tools that I, as an architect, know I have, and that the general public has a few of those tools. Yeah, so maybe that is the way forward, is that we are doing exactly that on a bigger scale.
And the computer came at the perfect time to deal with this, right? And it's radically changing our notion of the traditional notions of the role of the model and the role of drawing. And I should have said, they're now de-aestheticized. And what's taking place, and you'll find in your practice, is that the model is less kind of important in defining you, is the nature of your interest artistically, and it's now much more connected to the reality of the various performances that this thing has to take.
Yeah, it's both like democratizing the process, and then I think also allows for the professional to still have that place where it's gotten the general public to a level, and then when it's appropriate, you can reach out and go further. So it's an exciting place to be.
I feel like it's a whole other podcast episode on mixed media and how we could leverage that. I mean, that gets really exciting where, there's oftentimes kind of this like bottleneck or you get stuck in a design, and just switching mediums is so helpful to kind of break through that. And I think that's impressive, David. I don't know. I think you have probably a very good interior design eye, but you were stuck in that moment, and you're like, how do I get past this? And you used kind of this shortcut method that kind of sparked some ideas that let you kind of move it forward. And yeah, getting stuck sucks, but then not being scared to just let's try something new to get me out of it, I think is very interesting and pretty inspiring, actually. To
kind of, if I can, just to bring it back to, again, my first year of architecture school, the very first activity they had us do in studio was we had to go to the project site. They had us do a building very first semester, and they took us to the buildings, to the site, and we had to do some sketches of like not of the whole site. We had to go like almost micro scale and just sketch something. So I chose like mooring rings because it was an old canal, and the kind of iron mooring rings from the 1780s or whatever. And we had to sketch, and then from that sketch we had to do a 3D interpretation of that sketch, and then we had to sketch the model we'd made, and then we had to make a model of the sketch, and so it just morphed. I'm not sure I fully understood the exercise, but it created a form that was deliberately gone from very like photoreal kind of sketching to 3D, to then an abstract sketch, to then 3D again, and then it was supposed to inspire your building and form, and it was just a method of creating built form. But it was all about jumping around to get your mind thinking differently.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, it gets me just excited about trying different things. Yeah, awesome, guys. Well, looks like we might make it just under the hour, so I really appreciate both your time. Yeah, really happy I asked you guys to jump on this episode. So, I mean, this was just fantastic. Yeah, Wyatt, can you take pictures of those books, and I'll make sure to add them as references and funny images.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
No, thank you, Laszlo. We certainly enjoyed our time with you, and look forward to hearing what you tackle next.
Yeah, awesome, guys.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Episode 4. If you like, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any ideas for future podcasts or would like to join the conversation, go ahead and leave a comment or reach out to me directly.
It looks like Walt Disney threw up.